Is he going to know
Why is he going? Why is he going?
Nice presentation.
Next to David. There's a seat next to
Oh yeah.
one.
He's skating.
Another one. I don't know how to
I can't move the front one. No.
Okay. Okay. Let's walk around the front while they're fixing
Yeah, it's for one of my money.
I was even gonna dunk on you.
So I worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian for 30 years. And we tried to situate, part of the story is situate the African American story in an international context. So Joseph Harris travels the world and looks at all the places that Africans are taken from East Africa. I'll just talk. That's a 1990 map. This is a 2020 map based on the insurance records of all of the slave ships. Every slave ship, British, Portuguese, French, Spanish, are insured by the same insurance companies, and the banks that we have now are inherited from the same banks. Of the 12.5 million Africans taken across the Atlantic, only 5% come to the United States. 6 million are taken to Brazil, 1 million each to Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba. Fewer than 500,000 come to the United States. We have to, as U.S. citizens, realize that we are only part of a very small part of a huge story. Look at how many Africans are taken across the Sahara from West Africa into North Africa, from Somalia into Saudi, from the East African trade controlled by the Sultan of Oman into the Red Sea, into the Persian Gulf, into India. This African diaspora is much larger than we think of. It's not just a transatlantic story. It's a story also from East Africa into the Americas. So when we think of migrations, we can't just think of South Carolina to New York. It's a much bigger picture of African people being moved. So every country in the hemisphere has formal slavery. Every country had a different date of emancipation. And this map shows that from Canada, 1833, and all the British colonies,
No.
all the French colonies abolished slavery twice. With the French Revolution in 1789, 1794, they were actually freed. Napoleon reestablishes slavery. His first wife, the Empress Josephine, is a slave owner and sugar planter in Martinique. So he reinstates slavery in 1802, and slavery isn't abolished in the French colonies from Martinique, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Louisiana, until 1848. So every country, every person coming here from anywhere in the Americas has been part of a slave-based system, a legal system of slavery, and the ensuing discrimination that follows. So people in Brazil are looking at the United States for strategies of how you become equal in society. How do you use your legal system to seek equality in education and economics and access to resources. The Dutch abolished slavery in 1863, same year that we did. So that Curaçao, Suriname have the same emancipation date that we do. People from the British colonies, it's 1833. Look at all of Central America, it's 1820s, 1830s. The next to last country to free its enslaved people is Cuba in 1886. and the last is Brazil in 1888. This history is not told in most of these places, and certainly not here. This is what Washington looked like when New York was the capital, and when Philadelphia was the capital, and then it's decided in the 1780s, early 1790s to create a new federal city. These are the plantation and the men and women who own the plantations in what is now Washington, D.C. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see Widow Young and Widow Wheeler. Martha Washington, George was her second husband. Her first husband, when he died, she inherited all of his slaves. And those are the people who quarried the rocks for the Smithsonian headquarters, the Smithsonian Castle. So you see all of our 19th century institutions and 18th century institutions have a basis in slavery. And our universities now are exploring, and there's a consortium called Universities Studying Slavery. All of our 17th, 18th, and 19th century universities have to look at their legacy of slavery and its importance now. This is my grandfather, Calvin Franklin, in college in Nashville, Tennessee, in 1899 on the left. Excuse me, 1899 on the right, 1901 on the left. His people are slaves to Chickasaw Indians in Tennessee. My great-grandfather was born in 1820. When the American Indian Removal Act occurs in 1832, all the native people are rounded up and taken to Indian territory. He's the first person to go to college in 1896. A lot of the historically black colleges, we were doing this yesterday around the discussion. 1860s, 1870s. So these historically black colleges are quite old institutions, and therefore there's these generations of African Americans trained in these institutions. My grandfather meets his wife at college. My grandmother, on our mother's side, both go to Livingstone College. They graduate in 1903, 1904, and our grandmother meets her husband at that time. These are college-educated people. Karen's grandparents were in college in South Carolina. So they're not just first generations now, like many previous generations of college-educated African Americans. We're going to take a tour around the world to see how institutions in Brazil, in this case, look at where people came from in Africa to different parts of Brazil in different years. This is 1700. This is the 19th century. This is a museum, not the most recent one that burned. This is the Museum of the Portuguese Language that burned in Sao Paulo 2 years ago. They have a timeline going back to the 1530s, looking at where all the people are brought from in other parts of the world, Brazil. And the museum goes back to 4000 BC. And here it shows Congolese culture that comes into Yoruba and Ewe and Fon culture that comes into Brazilian culture. This is it's not a slave ship, it's a tender, the ship that takes you between the slave ship and land. And in this case, this is in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Afro-Brazilian Museum. This is in France. France is deeply involved in the slave trade, and the former prime minister and former foreign minister, Jean-Marc Ayrault, was mayor of Nantes, the major French slave trading city. And so he builds a memorial, which he opens in 2012, showing all the places that Africans are taken from and taken to. And the houses below the memorial are the houses of the slave trade. He chose a very appropriate place to march to. And lived on the island of Glory in West Africa. And at the inauguration, they dropped rose petals into the water to honor the ancestors. This is Richmond. In downtown Richmond, which is the center of the internal slave trade, they're doing archaeological work on Lumpkin Slave Jail. Signs about slave trade in Richmond. This is the river where the ships came up in Richmond, where Gabriel Prosser is executed. This is a slave cemetery in Florida, in St. Petersburg. To the slaves buried in Oaklawn Cemetery in peace sleep on. God's hands, each broken hand will mend. This is the British Museum in London. Sir Hahn Sloane, who started the British Museum, was a collector. His wife was a sugar planter. He comes to Jamaica in the early 1600s, and he collects a drum in Virginia, which he assumes is Native American, but it's Akan. It's from Ghana, and it's been used to, quote, exercise the Africans on the slave ship. And they did an exhibition around this single artifact at the British Museum. Who built the Capitol? Irishman and enslaved African. Who built the White House? Some people are just learning who built the White House. Hello. Around the corner from White House is a historic home on Lafayette Square. And this side of the building is so beautiful. But facing the National Chamber of Commerce is this long beige building with green shutters. People walk by it every day. They're the slave quarters today. Inside the building, but on the sidewalk, you would know that there's slave quarters a block from the White House. It's the inside court. The end of the National Urban League's office in Northern Virginia is in what was the Franklin and Armfield slave pit. They created an exhibition in the basement telling the history of that building. This is Zanzibar. Karen and I went to a conference in 2009, the African Diaspora Heritage Trail. We don't think of the East African slave trade, but here's a memorial memory for the slaves. Sculpture project by Bagamoyo, 1997-1998. Martinique. I started going to Martinique when I was 17. And this is a monument to people who died in this shipwreck.